You're hearing okay? We're going to by Seth Schindler, who's next to me, and Jessica DeCaio, who's somewhere in the world watching from some airport, she just said. So hello, Jessica. And the way this is going to work out is first Seth will now introduce the book, the main idea behind it. Then we'll have two of the book's chapter authors. One, Meredith, whom I will introduce eventually, and Maximiliano as well, who we both wrote together one chapter, but he's going to be introducing it, and Meredith will be introducing hers. And then I will work as a commentator. I will give some comments on the overall book. And then we'll have a session of questions and discussion of whatever comes up out of this. So, all right, rules of engagement laid out. And so, first of all, I introduced Seth Schindler, who's a senior lecturer in urban development and transformation at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. But he's North American in the United States. So what city are you from? Detroit. Who happens not to be a coincidence because he's a specialist in deindustrialization. I remember you told me that. He's co-director of research of the African Cities Program Consortium. And well, he also worked as a coordinator in the Global Studies Program at Humboldt University in Berlin. And okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and thank you to all of you who have taken the time to come here this evening. I know everyone is extremely busy, so yeah, I'm grateful that you've come in and you're giving me your attention. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to talk a bit about the book. Sorry, I'll just put this into cases. See?
Yeah.
Okay. And
yeah. I don't think you're sharing.
It's not sharing now. Okay. Wait.
It's not sharing.
No, basically, because
okay. So I'm going to introduce the book somewhat, but really I'm going to contextualize it and give you some ideas about some of the conversations we were having and how they've evolved in the course of from when we started preparing this book and where we're at now, as the world has changed significantly. So I also don't want to speak for my friends and colleagues, but I do want to acknowledge that many of the ideas that I'll present today were developed collectively with a group of friends, some of whom are here with us today, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our group toward the end of the talk. But one of the things that we spoke about quite a bit when we were beginning to conceptualize this book, Jessica and I, we started this project at a workshop in Beijing in 2019. And at that time, it was a little bit unclear where US-China relations were going. And so there was this debate around, the extent to which talking about a new Cold War or a second Cold War was appropriate or not. And the Financial Times thought it was. So in 2020, the Financial Times introduced this new Cold War series. Henry Kissinger concurred, and he said around the same time that the United States and China were in the foothills or the beginning of a new Cold War. And then in 2021, in Foreign Affairs, Hal Brands and John Gaddis said that it's no longer debatable. The United States and China, tacit allies during the last half of the last Cold War, are entering their own new Cold War. Now, not everyone agrees. So the most significant pushback against that came directly in response to that article from Brands and Gaddis, from Joseph Nye, who said that in fact the Cold War analogy is lazy. He said that it's just too different from the Cold War, the original Cold War. So one of the things that I want to do, and I think most of my colleagues in the group that we've established are in agreement with, is that we want to reframe this debate. I don't think it's very helpful. I don't think that the Cold War is an analogy at all, just as World War II is not an analogy of World War I, right? And I've never heard anyone say that the Second Opium War is an analogy for the First Opium War. Instead, we talk about, say, the World Wars as discrete events, but we call them first and second because they're part of, they're related insofar as that they're in a series that is structured by an overarching historical process. In the case of the World Wars, it was the emergence of rising powers that wanted to influence the international order, right, and to displace the global hegemons and the old empires of that time. I think we can say something similar about the Cold Wars. I think China's pursuit, the Chinese Communist Party's pursuit of strength and wealth, its attempt to be central to world affairs and influence the international order, those have been the objectives even since before 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party managed to unify the country and win the revolution. These objectives have been very consistent, but the strategy has changed. So under Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party pursued a kind of revolutionary evangelism, according to one author, and sought to export revolution to countries worldwide. Under Deng Xiaoping, of course, the country embarked on economic reforms, and the best way to achieve strength and wealth and centrality to world affairs at that time, according to the leadership in Beijing, was to integrate with the global economy and join international institutions. Strategies in Beijing have changed once again under Xi Jinping, and we see the reassertion of the party state, its centrality to economy and society, in pursuit of what Xi Jinping and others call national rejuvenation. So I argue that the US and US-China rivalry is most accurately conceptualized as a second Cold War. And this narrative then forces us to reappraise China's role in the First Cold War, right? Not as a mere kind of stand-in or as a supporting cast to Moscow, but as a primary protagonist itself. So historians are doing this already. There's a great book by Jeremy Friedman called Shadow Cold War, where he details the competition between Moscow and Beijing for allies in the so-called Third World. Greg Brzezinski has a great book called Winning the Third World. It's about the US-China conflict in the so-called Third World. And he shows that at some points in the Cold War, American Cold Warriors considered China enemy number one rather than the Soviet Union. And we see a growing interest in China's role in the long global 60s as a leader of anti-imperialist revolution. Sometimes this goes by the term global Maoism. You can read Matthew Rothwell's work. Matthew Galway has a new book out just this year focusing on Cambodia. But I think that's been forgotten because beginning in the early 1970s, of course, there was a rapprochement between the US and China, and according to one of the leading Chinese historians on the Cold War, Chen Jian, that the Cold War then reverted from a three-way contest to a two-way contest. And indeed, there are many significant differences between the First and Second Cold Wars, just as the First and Second World Wars differ in many ways, trench warfare versus blitzkrieg. I will focus on one of the primary differences, which is its territorial logic. So in the First Cold War, of course, there was a zero-sum conflict to control territory, and most countries struggled to remain non-aligned. Most countries were accounted for by being associated with one of the superpowers, China, the US, or the Soviet Union. And so we think of terms like containment, capitalist encirclement, domino theory, all of these are very territorial, right? And territory then becomes associated with the sphere of influence of a superpower. That is not at all what's happening today. There's a great quote here from Mike Pompeo in his speech entitled Communist China and the Free World's Future that he gave at the Nixon Library. And he said, this isn't about containment, don't buy that. It's about a complex new challenge that we've never faced before. The USSR was closed off from the free world. Communist China is already within our borders. So if the territorial logic is not about controlling territory, then what is the nature of the US-China rivalry? Well, here I argue that it's a competition for centrality in a series of interrelated networks. Digital networks, that's hardware and software, and their combination. Production networks in particular sectors, these are the key sectors of the 21st century, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, robotics, biotech, etc., and infrastructure networks. Of course, infrastructure networks were the primary focus of of this book. But I'm going to talk about all three of these in the next few minutes. So, with my friend and colleague Steve Rolfe, we focused on this seeming contradiction, where on the one hand, you have about 7 large super platforms like Alibaba, Amazon, Google, that control a very significant proportion of global commerce. I don't have the number off the top of my head. But on the one hand, these platforms are so large that there is a perception that you can't regulate them, right? They are beyond the reach of states. On the other hand, there's a growing body of scholarship that details the role that states are playing in the economy today. So the UN Commission for Trade and Development says that there are more industrial strategies being implemented right now than at any time in history, as in 2018. The IMF Fiscal Monitor has an issue on state-owned enterprises, and they say that about half of global GDP is in some way controlled by state-owned enterprises. So it's not only China that is a participant in markets. In other words, states are not only regulating markets, but they're participating in them in new ways. If you want to look at state capitalism literature, you can see work from Vila, Adam Dixon. But these are two competing points, right? I mean, on the one hand, states are strong, on the other hand, they can't regulate these large platforms. And Steve and I try and reconcile that, and we say that both China and the US seek to control their platforms, their domestic platforms, instrumentalize them, and mobilize them in pursuit of geo-economic and geostrategic objectives. And we refer to this as state platform capitalism. So how do they do that, and how do they control their digital networks? In China, it's rather straightforward. There's direct regulation. Probably many of you follow the story where Ant, or that's the parent company of Alibaba, was going to issue an IPO to raise capital, and that was blocked by Beijing. Later, Jack Ma disappeared for a while, and upon when he resurfaced, he had a very different story to tell about the appropriate role of the state and regulation. The US, it's a little bit different. So the US tries to combine Silicon Valley firms or integrate them with the defense sector. That's the name of the game. And here you see the Defense Innovation Board. It was established in 2016. Its first chairman was Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. It's now chaired by Mike Bloomberg, a former presidential hopeful and mayor of New York City. And according to the website of the Defense Innovation Board, it advises the Department of Defense, quote, on emerging technologies and innovative approaches that Department of Defense should adapt to ensure US technological and military dominance. So we see a fusing of these platforms in Silicon Valley with the military-industrial complex. Similarly, the Clean Network Initiative was introduced during the Trump years. And the name is pretty awful because what it says is that for a network to be determined clean, it cannot have Chinese components in any of these aspects of cloud, cable, pathway, and so on. Of course, if it was safe network, that would be a bit different, but clean is pretty awful because there's a kind of an allusion to pollution, and it reminds me of this kind of yellow peril, quote-unquote, fear. In any case, what they attempted to do with this initiative is to say that data that traveled across a path that was not clean, i.e. that had to go through, say, somehow go through Huawei components, for example, could not enter the United States. And that has been backburnered, but I think there we see another example of how the US government hopes to support its platforms and confront Chinese platforms. Finally, the last thing I'll point out is the America's Frontier Fund, which is a venture capital fund. Take a look at it, it's quite interesting. It's a venture capital firm that seeks to mobilize private capital for defense-related startups in the tech sector. And it says, quote, we are in a great power competition and the United States is falling behind. We are also on the cusp of a new wave of innovation. We face a critical moment of opportunities to secure our nation's strategic advantage while generating outsized financial returns. So that's digital, the state platform capitalism for you. Also, I'll move now to the competition for centrality in production networks. And here I want to introduce this term geostrategic decoupling. So first of all, decoupling is happening. And by decoupling, all I mean is that global value chains are being disintermediated at the behest of nation states, namely the US, but also some of its allies, in pursuit of geostrategic and geoeconomic objectives that is, again, dominance in certain key sectors. Semiconductors is a great example. So the point here is that the division of international division of labor cannot be reduced to a simple reflection of the cost of factors of production or total factor productivity. That's a fancy way of saying that, unlike the unipolar era after the First Cold War, when multinational corporations were mobile and simply located in places where there were chief factors of production, there are now political considerations, or geostrategic ones, that are determining the geography of production in key sectors. So, to underscore this point, here's a great quote from Christina Lagarde. She's the former chair and director of the IMF, so I'm sure you're familiar with her here in Argentina. But she's also the current president of the European Central Bank. And she said that I don't think we're going back to that environment of low inflation. There are forces that have been unleashed as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the massive geopolitical shock, she's referring to the war in Ukraine, that are going to change the picture and landscape within which we operate. Some would argue that the place where you manufacture or place from which you provide services is going to be decided by different factors than just cost. So what are those different factors? She goes on to say it's going to be determined by whether or not a country is friend or foe. So again, we see that it's not just the cost, but political allegiances and geostrategic considerations that will determine the economic geography of certain key sectors. And now I will turn to infrastructure networks. And here's where we talk about the rise of the infrastructure state. So I think I don't need to introduce the Belt and Road Initiative. It used to be called Belt on Road. I think probably most of you are familiar with it. Argentina is a recent member, of course. But then, of course, the US introduced the Build Back Better World Initiative in the G7 meeting, in Joe Biden's first G7 meeting. That was 2021 and 2022. That was upgraded or evolved into what's called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. And infrastructure has become a central arena of competition between the US and its allies and China. It wasn't always that way. This is quite a belated event. I mean, Xi Jinping introduced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. At that time, it was called One Belt, One Road, and it was not even considered newsworthy. The announcement that he made was not considered newsworthy by Foreign Policy or the Financial Times. The Belt and Road debuted in the Financial Times in 2015, and rather than high-stakes geopolitical gambit, it was described as, quote, a program focused on building infrastructure, including ports, roads, railway, and oil pipelines in the poorer parts of China and countries along the Silk Road. So, not very threatening at all, right? More remarkable yet was that the BRI first appeared in Foreign Affairs in 2016, and in an article authored by Gal Luft, he said, quote, the US should, quote, reassure some of its allies, particularly those in Southeast Asia, where anxiety about China's ascendance runs deep, that the Belt and Road is largely a force for economic development rather than Chinese expansionism. Okay, so that was the kind of initial assessment, was that it was either unimportant or that it was a kind of a vehicle for economic development. Things changed, of course, quite rapidly, probably most notably because of the election of Donald Trump. But the view in Washington evolved considerably in a very short period of time, and the Belt and Road then came to symbolize the so-called China challenge. And it necessitated a whole of government response, and many a whole of government response. However, many countries have taken advantage of it, and they've also tried to take advantage of the opportunities offered more recently by the United States and its allies to fund infrastructure. So, what we hope to show within this book is that many countries have successfully avoided the pressure to align exclusively either with the United States or China. They've navigated this complex geopolitical reality, a world in which we live, to secure support for infrastructure projects and spatial projects that have been on their agenda sometimes for decades. Many of these projects are so complex that they necessitate institutional reforms, what Neil Brenner refers to as state restructuring. And this can be something like, for example, regulatory reform to streamline land acquisition, which is complex in most countries, to the creation of pockets of effectiveness where there's a kind of lack of capacity in some cases. Other times we see that power is resituated within the state, or perhaps there's the establishment of an entirely new bureaucracy to undertake these spatial projects, which are again financed by China, but not only by China, also by a host of new funders. So we do see a pattern, or I see a pattern, of a centralization of power, where we see the rise of the infrastructure state, but that is ultimately the result of some of these, of state restructuring. Is that we see what Jessica and Dinesh Pavel and I referred to in an article in Transactions as the infrastructure state. Its legitimacy is at least partly dependent on its ability to pursue and achieve state spatial projects and very large-scale infrastructure projects, which are typically part and parcel of their development strategy and related to industrial objectives, namely structural transformation. Perhaps you can think here of Argentina Proactiva 2030, which is a new industrial policy that I think is quite heavy on infrastructure. In any case, this competition for network centrality makes it quite difficult to imagine what winning the Second Cold War means, right? I mean, think of any country. The US might be central to a country's production networks, while China might be central to its digital networks. What do we make of that country's position then within this competition? Is it in a US sphere of influence or a Chinese one? To complicate matters further, countries can flip and change quite quickly. That happened, of course, during the First World War, when countries, the United States was terrified that you'd have the domino theory. It explains that a country would become communist and then suddenly all the countries neighboring it would become communist, right? But for a country to flip in the First World War from one side to another typically required a very dramatic event, maybe a military coup, a right-wing military coup, or a leftist revolution. Now you can simply have the election of a new president who says, actually, we're just going to get rid of Huawei, or we're going to cancel these infrastructure deals with China. And so countries can change quite quickly. So this draws then attention to the agency of smaller countries, particularly regional powers and middle powers, if you will. And that's something that this book focuses on extensively. So the agency of countries within this conflict and the resistance to choosing a side. So we explore all of these issues further in what we call the Second Cold War Observatory. And we're launching a website in September, which will coincide with the publication of the book. We're a group of scholars, and we just want to offer free, informed analysis. There will be a podcast series, some of our own research, an archive of documents pertaining to the US-China rivalry. So keep an eye on that. If you have questions, you can email me at seth.schindler@manchester.ac.uk. But I think I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thanks. Okay, so now we're going to have the second presenter, who's also an author of one of the chapters, and her name is Meredith DeBoom, who's an assistant professor of geography at the University of South Carolina in the United States. Her research analyzes the geopolitics of resource extraction, development, and distribution, with an emphasis on Africa-China relations. She's particularly interested in how Africans engage with geopolitical and energy transitions to pursue domestic political goals. Meredith's research has been supported by the American Association of University Women, the National Science Foundation, and the University of Michigan Society of Fellows, and she holds a PhD in geography from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Well, Meredith, go ahead, you have 20 minutes as well as everyone else, and that's it.
And if you want to share, do you have a PowerPoint, Meredith? You can share your screen.
Yes, it looks like the sharing is disabled. Is there a way to enable that?
De sharing. Para compartir el PowerPoint later.
¿No puedo hacerlo directamente?
Make a co-host, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
No,
Anfitrión. No, abajo, ahí.
Aquí.
Sí.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe try it out.
Yes, it works now. Perfect, thank you.
Luckily. You know.
Okay, just a moment. All right, are you seeing everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So first, thank you so much to Seth and Jessica DiCarlo for putting together this fantastic book project and bringing all these kind of diverse case studies together under one overarching framework. And then special thanks to Maximiliano and Marcelo for their work on today's event and for inviting me to join. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be presenting a chapter titled Radioactive Strategies, Uranium Infrastructure, African Agency, and the Longue Durée of Nuclear Geopolitics in Namibia. And I've been working on China-Namibia relations since about 2011, and specifically on uranium since 2013. More recently, I've kind of expanded a bit broader to focus on the geopolitics of low carbon energy transition. So I'm really interested in kind of the green economy and emerging green resources, including hydrogen and phosphate. But today I'm going to focus specifically on Namibia and uranium, since that's what this work is based on. So first, a little bit of background on the chapter. In December 2018, then U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton introduced the Prosper Africa policy, which was the Trump administration's new Africa strategy. Bolton asserted that the policy reflected the U.S. government's desire for, quote, African nations to succeed, flourish, and remain independent, in fact, and not just in theory. His speech, however, sounded much more like a China policy, as you might expect, than a thoughtful proposal for relations with a continent of 54 sovereign states. In total, the speech, which was about 21 minutes long, mentioned China or Chinese 20 times, and had very little kind of specific detail for any African countries that might have been listening in. Although this was ostensibly a new policy, Prosper Africa's China-centric narrative obviously has some deep historical roots. Great power policymakers, analysts, and media outlets have long characterized Africa as a chessboard for geopolitical competition, rather than a continent whose leaders pursue their own objectives, as Seth was just talking about. These characterizations are especially prominent during times of high geopolitical rivalry, like the current moment. Diplomatic correspondences from the European Scramble for Africa and the Cold War, for example, are full of chessboard metaphors. And there are obviously similar themes at play in debates over the new Cold War. While these narratives are excellent fodder for selling foreign affairs magazines, they often overlook how non-great power actors adapt to and influence the on-the-ground dynamics of geopolitical rivalries, and moreover leverage those rivalries to pursue their own objectives. The goal of this chapter is to challenge those kind of chessboard interpretations, and specifically to challenge them in a realm that's often assumed to be the sole purview of great powers, which is nuclear infrastructures. The chapter analyzes how African actors have employed radioactive strategies, by which I mean tactics that use uranium's geopolitical significance to advance their goals. I investigate these strategies across a range of temporalities, from European colonialism to the war on climate change, drawing heavily on archival data as well as some interviews. Today I'm going to hit just some of the highlights of that work, focusing specifically on 5 key moments of transition detailed in the chapter. So we'll start with origins. Uranium has long been used by Namibians, but commercial extraction dates to German colonization. In 1884, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck claimed Namibia as a German protectorate and enlisted British investors to aid in a strategy of territorialization through extraction. Local resistance, however, quickly constrained German ambitions. Leaders of the Nama and Herero groups who lived in the region refused to recognize German claims or authority. Resistance intensified in the early 1900s, culminating in the siege of a German fort by Herero forces. Germany thus began a 4-year genocidal war against the Herero and the Nama. Survivors were forced into starvation in the Kalahari Desert or sent to concentration camps. And this genocide was decimating. German forces killed an estimated 75% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama during this time. Germany's genocidal strategy facilitated subsequent land expropriation in the region. Between 1908 and 1914, mining operators recorded some of the highest profits in German colonial history. Uranium discoveries were made during this time, but it was primarily used as a glass coloring agent and a photographic tint at the time. Its significance wouldn't be clear later until the identification of nuclear fission, which would take another 20 years. Germany's fortunes changed in 1915 when the Union of South Africa captured Namibia during World War I. Seizing an opportunity for territorial expansion, South African authorities encouraged Afrikaners to settle in Namibia. The League of Nations rewarded this expansion by granting South Africa a Class C mandate over Namibia at the war's end. So here we can actually see some South African kind of spatial strategy taking advantage of this World War I moment to enhance its own spatial goals. It quickly became clear that South Africa had little intention of guiding Namibia toward independence, as the mandate would demand. Instead, its leaders used mining infrastructure to strengthen their territorial control over not only Namibia, but also over South Africa through industrialization-led development, fueled in part by Namibian resources. Geologist Peter Lowe confirmed uranium deposits at Rossing Mountain during this time, but his findings were overshadowed by the Great Depression and by the low concentration of Namibia's deposits. The subsequent 2 decades, however, brought significant geopolitical and regional change that would make Namibian uranium increasingly important. In 1938, of course, nuclear fission catalyzed a global uranium hunt. South Africa subsequently rejected the newly established United Nations plan to convert Namibia into a trust territory. Shortly thereafter, in 1948, South Africa became an apartheid state, and Namibia became its occupied territory. By the 1960s, the intensification of the Cold War meant that Rossing's low uranium concentrations were no longer an obstacle. They could be marketed. The South African government took advantage of increased demand and limited supply to pursue its own radioactive ambitions. In 1965, its representatives met with British companies to discuss exports. South Africa, importantly, also waived end-use restrictions during this time, which meant that its uranium, unlike that of Canada, for example, could be used for nuclear weapons. This was an important selling point for countries like the UK. There was only one catch. Namibia had to remain governed by South Africa. This was apparently no problem for a British company like Rio Tinto, which purchased the license for Rossing the following year. As you might expect, Rossing was very quickly embroiled in geopolitical controversy. Shortly after the Rio Tinto purchase, South Africa acknowledged that it had built a full-scale uranium enrichment plant, catalyzing suspicions that it would pursue nuclear weapons. You can see a photo here. These suspicions were confirmed in 1993 when 6 nuclear warheads were destroyed on the eve of its democratic transition. In 1971, meanwhile, the UN declared South Africa's continued occupation of Namibia illegal, and thus its uranium exports illegal, which further intensified international scrutiny. I'll get to that in a minute. Despite the controversy, Rio Tinto expanded its exports during this time, including to France, Japan, the US, and West Germany. The continued market for Namibian uranium, despite South Africa's growing pariah status, can be explained by the apartheid labor system, Cold War priorities, and a marketing strategy by South Africa and Rio Tinto that was very much in line with the times. With uranium producers like the US, Australia, and Canada facing tightened labor regulations, and thus production costs, South Africa framed Rossing's oppressive and tightly controlled apartheid operations, which were complete with a police force to enforce production, as commercially advantageous. Basically, they were at little risk for strike. Western governments even attempted to portray Rossing as something of a force for capitalist good during this time, framing South Africa's economic integration via uranium as essential to its long-term political reform. It wasn't only Western authorities who were pushing this message, though. Historian Gabriel Hecht chronicles how apartheid leaders leveraged the kind of introduction of this message to reinforce and pursue their own ends. In a 1970 statement, for example, which was delivered in English to appeal to a Western audience, South African Prime Minister B.J. Vorster argued that, quote, under South African conditions, a large-scale enrichment plant can be competitive with existing plants in the West. South Africa does not intend to withhold the considerable advantages inherent in this development from the world community. We are therefore prepared to collaborate with any non-communist country desiring to do so, but subject to the conclusion of an agreement safeguarding our interests, end quote. The continuation of apartheid and the continued occupation of Namibia were both among these interests. South Africa wasn't the only party with a radioactive strategy during this time, though. Namibia's liberation movements leveraged the affective power of nuclearity, the way that anything involving nuclear could really stoke attention and headlines to pursue a multi-dimensional and multi-scalar strategy for Namibia's independence. The Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO, was particularly adept at these strategic international engagements. Working with African states through the UN, SWAPO pursued a series of special hearings on the illegal export of Namibian uranium. It then publicized the findings of these hearings through collaborations with anti-nuclear, anti-war, and anti-apartheid campaigns, including on Western college campuses. These movements, in turn, were recruited as allies for Namibia's independence. SWAPO's strategy extended well beyond activism. It also pursued military support from the communist bloc, including Cuba, the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and East Germany. This multi-dimensional strategy, with multiple actors, even throughout the Cold War, when relations, for example, were not good between the Soviet Union and China, enabled SWAPO to effectively play all sides of the Cold War, not just in an East-West sense, but within the communist bloc, within the capitalist bloc. As a veteran of the liberation struggle explained to me, and this is a quote from him, uranium was key to SWAPO those days. It took us out of the apartheid shadow and made Namibian independence a cause of its own. Here we were, the African colonies still fighting for freedom. We couldn't go without uranium in terms of economics, but the same was true for politics. It's important to note that the independence wasn't SWAPO's only goal during this time. There was a multi-scalar strategy at play. Its leaders also drew on the effective power of nuclearity to cultivate support for SWAPO as the assumed ruling party-to-be of what would soon become an independent Namibia. By the 1960s, SWAPO would convince the UN to designate it as the authentic representative of the Namibian people, despite significant competition from other political groups within Namibia. The international anti-apartheid movement, for example, thus began to call not only for Namibia's independence, but also for solidarity with SWAPO. Its international backing not only strengthened its anti-apartheid efforts, it also strengthened SWAPO's domestic legitimacy, laying the groundwork for the party's ongoing, albeit a little bit diminished more recently, dominance of Namibian politics. As Namibia's 1990 independence neared, however, SWAPO also had to recalibrate its specific strategy toward Racine. Calls to nationalize Racine had been a cornerstone of SWAPO rhetoric for a long time. But prices in the late 1980s were less than half what they had been in the 1960s when the mine opened. Yet Racine still represented 10% of national GDP and 40% of export earnings. Wary of losing an economically important actor on the eve of independence, SWAPO carefully navigated between cultivating anti-apartheid outrage, which involved castigating Racine in public, and privately ensuring Racine's commitment to continued operations in a free Namibia. Ultimately, geopolitics quashed any remaining nationalization ambitions. With the end of the Cold War, the ideological wind shifted, and SWAPO shifted its political strategy accordingly. This was nowhere clearer than in SWAPO's increasingly friendly relationship with Racine after independence. The party of nationalization in the 1970s and early 1980s had become the party of the post-colonial neoliberal state, with low mining royalties and a minimal state role. By the mid-2000s, SWAPO's transformation was so incontrovertible that the revolutionary movement, formerly aligned with Cuba, was praised as a foreign investment pioneer by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times. Still, many SWAPO leaders indicated to me that they were privately determined during this time to break Racine's dominance of Namibian uranium. The opportunity to do so didn't arise until 20 years later, when China's rise opened the possibility for a new radioactive strategy. In the meantime, SWAPO leaders catered to Rio Tinto, the same company they had accused of plundering Namibia. It was far from a point of pride, but SWAPO's dependence on Racine was a strategic necessity. In the early 2000s, SWAPO encountered a new challenge, though, US surveillance. In the wake of false Iraq War claims about Saddam Hussein's uranium supply source, Western governments channeled terrorism concerns into surveillance of African states. Tensions in Namibia peaked in 2009, when 2 Racine employees, a member of the Namibian Defense Force, stole uranium from the mine. Although the theft was not connected to terrorism, it did prompt a US audit and intensive on-site monitoring. Many of the Namibian officials I've interviewed over the years bristled at this exercise of extraterritorial sovereignty, but the US accounted for 30% of Racine's exports at the time. Thus, they publicly deferred to the US, but the incident stoked frustration within the party. When asked to identify the reasons behind China's subsequent rise, informants often told me about US surveillance, or relatedly, the paternalism of US officials in their engagements with the government. Intensified surveillance also came at a moment when support for Racine was starting to wane within SWAPO. In 2003, Racine announced plans to end its operations due to falling prices. It also announced its intent to challenge the Namibian government's low mining royalties in court, a decision that did not go over well. Ultimately, however, this challenge was rendered moot by subsequent events. In the early 2000s, climate change concerns prompted speculation in the uranium market, and after 3 decades of stagnation, prices increased more than 13-fold between 2003 and 2007. Investments in Namibia quadrupled. Chinese state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, emerged as frontrunners in this at the time, but it was a very crowded field with competition from all over the world: Australia, Russia, China, France, and so on. The boom abruptly ended, however, in March 2011 following the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Namibia was hit particularly hard. Japan represented about a quarter of its exports at the time. Price stagnation set in, and prices declined to US $30 per pound, less than a quarter of their 2007 high. It's important to note here that below about $40 a pound, more than half of the world's uranium mines, including all of Namibia's, operate below the break-even point. Exploration projects were halted around the world. At first glance, this decline would seem to bode quite poorly for SWAPO's aim of reducing Namibian dependency on rossing. But not all uranium producers make investment decisions based on spot prices alone. And here is where China's rise is incredibly important in the Namibian story. Reflecting the logics of state capitalism and reminiscent of Cold War era investments that often defied commercial profitability, Chinese investments in uranium reflect state-based incentives, including its plan to reduce carbon emissions through nuclear energy. Namibian officials have updated their rhetoric accordingly. You may not be able to see this on the slide, but the truck that you're seeing here says SWAPO Uranium, and then underneath it says Clean Energy from Namibia, and this is the new branding of Namibian uranium. Chinese state-owned firms continue to dominate in investments. As one industry informant explained, quote, "There was and is great suspicion of the Chinese in Namibia, but we would have collapsed without them. The persistence of uranium mining in Namibia, despite market conditions that shuttered mines around the world, is really inconceivable without Chinese state-based investments." Namibia's government has fundamentally changed its spatial strategy for extraction in the wake of this geopolitical shift. 20 years ago, there were no Chinese investments in Namibian uranium, and Rio Tinto was the only company in town. Today, Chinese SOEs hold majority stakes in all of Namibia's operating uranium mines, and notably that includes rossing, in which a Chinese state firm purchased a majority stake. It also includes Husab, which is pictured here, the world's second largest operating uranium mine. At US $5 billion, it's the largest investment in independent Namibia, and at the time of its construction, it was the largest single Chinese state investment in Africa. Once on the brink of losing its only uranium mine, Namibia is now the world's 4th largest producer. These investments have facilitated a significant change in SWAPO's spatial strategy, but a change that's been a long time coming, and that SWAPO has been pursuing since the 1960s. Namely, Chinese investments have enabled SWAPO to achieve 2 goals: an end to 40 years of rossing dominance, and the start of Namibian state ownership in the infrastructure of uranium mining. Unlike rossing, Husab's ownership is entirely state-based. China General Nuclear Power, or CGN, owns 90%, while Ipengalo, the Namibian government's own new state-owned mining enterprise, owns 10%. This outcome was not a historical accident. It was part of SWAPO's radioactive strategy. Recognizing an opening, Namibian officials negotiated partial ownership for Ipengalo during the license approval process for Husab. They also secured a Chinese loan to fund that ownership stake. Ipengalo, it's important to know, literally means government in Namibia's Oshigambo language. In geopolitical terms, then, we might think of Husab as the intersection of China's infrastructure-centric approach to strategic integration and SWAPO's own attempt at what Seth has elsewhere referred to as getting the territory right here. More than 25 years after independence, SWAPO has recast uranium infrastructures from colonial exploitation into infrastructures of its own design, even if not, importantly, its own ownership alone. 10% ownership stake is not convincing to many Namibians I keep in contact with. So in conclusion, media coverage of current infrastructural investments in the global south tends to focus, obviously, on geopolitical and economic rivalry between the US and China. This focus is neither historically novel, nor is it completely unwarranted. Infrastructure is indeed a geopolitical realm, but this exclusive focus on the agency of great powers risks overlooking how infrastructures take material and symbolic shape within and are in turn shaped by particular geographic and historical contexts, including the agency of non-great power actors. These place-space dynamics still matter. As Harvey and Knox note, quote, infrastructures do not simply reference or represent political ideology, but actively participate in often unexpected ways in the processes by which political relations are articulated and enacted. End quote. These processes are neither static, nor are they the sole purview of great powers. They're also shaped by non-great power actors, from states and social movements to political parties and commercial enterprises. And those actors in turn use infrastructures as tools in the pursuit of their own changing objectives. By taking agency and context seriously, research on the infrastructure state can shed new light on the multi-scalar enactments of geopolitical change and great power rivalries as well. And I will end there. Thank you so much to Maximiliano and Marcel for coordinating this, and to Seth and Jess for putting together this volume. And I'd be happy to chat with folks about my conversation yet tonight.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Meredith.
Sorry, now it's
No?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Meredith. Such rich analysis. I take it you did your PhD on this subject, right? I think I corrected a few things.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so you're very much an expert on the subject, and those conclusions that can wrap it up nicely. And okay, now we're going to turn to Maximiliano Vila Seoane, who's from the house. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina, CONICET. He's a professor at the School of Politics and Government at the National University of San Martin, where he teaches courses on international relations, cyber politics, and international communication. His research interests and publications focus on digitalization, international politics, and development studies. And he'll be presenting a chapter that we both wrote for this book, and but he'll do the work, which is a good part of this. So thank you, Maxi, and your 20 minutes.
Thanks. Thanks, Marcelo. Thanks to the audience. Thanks, Meredith, for your very interesting and detailed presentation. And thanks, Seth, of course, for being part of this project. What I will try to summarize in 20 minutes is what we did with Marcelo. That is a chapter where we engage with this idea of the infrastructure state, and in particular in the process of state restructuring, taking as our case study Argentina, of course, because we are from here, you may imagine, no? But also because it adds a lot to ongoing debates that we have and that we see daily, no? On national media, also in policy circles, where perhaps the mainstream view about Argentina's role on this fragmentary is, or we either take side with the US or China, or perhaps another more progressive view, well, not progressive sometimes, but also that's it, is to remain non-aligned, making this comparison that we are again in an old Cold War translated into the 2020s, without making all the nuances that you self-explained at the beginning. So that, let me explain that common sense view and what it adds, and then what we added with our argument, and what we challenged to a certain extent, considering this process of state restructuring. So the common view, of course, would focus on the national foreign policy. In the case of Argentina, we need to consider, let's say, in our chapter, we have to select a time span, we selected the last 10 years, and there we can clearly see different political coalitions within the country, some more center-left, others more center-right. And if we follow that narrative, for example, from 2011 to 2015, the coalition was left-wing, if you want. The relations with the US were quite strained because the US sided with Argentina's debtors, and that locked us out of financial markets. In that context, Argentina sought, well, you know this, no? We sought the government, other sources of funding, and China became as one of the main providers of funding and of infrastructure. In fact, in 2014, Argentina signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with China, not being part of the Belt and Road, so I want to mention that. And many projects were announced, and many of them began, others were delayed, related to the upgrade of railways, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power stations. That's related to what Meredith was speaking about, a deep space station in Patagonia. So, in essence, that would indicate that the country was signing or becoming communist, according to the critics, no, were siding more with China. The election of 2015 brought another coalition to power, a center-right coalition, that sought to realign our foreign policy directly with the US. At least that was the official promise, the pledge during the campaign. In principle, to precipitate an investment spread. Of course, after a year, we didn't even got a result. So that was quite a challenge for the government, at least from this foreign policy analysis. And the story says that, well, given that the Trump administration was more oriented to America first and we don't care for the rest, I simplify, the administration, the right wing, started to again recover the bilateral relation with China and to continue numerous projects initiated by the previous administration. So where is there the alignment with the US? Well, it was a bit loose. Nonetheless, the US was consequential, very consequential, for our current situation and for future generations, of course, due to the support for the national government to get an IMF loan, a world Guinness record standby, yes, it was a Guinness record, standby arrangement for $50 billion to be paid in 3 years. Now, the Trump administration official that negotiated, that was part of the IMF board, later he made public statements that was to prevent the Peronists to return, the national coalition to return to power, and China always appears somewhat the question. No? Well, the bet was wrong, the election was lost, and another coalition, another left wing similar to the one that ruled before, returned to power, but the relation with China and the US was not very much different from the previous. So here, although this common analysis tends to focus on these narratives and what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does and what the presidents do or say, and they are, of course, nuances and they add a lot to our understanding of the official foreign policy, they obscure much of the continuity, and other reasons that explain why Argentinians do not take sides regardless of the political party who is ruling the country. And that's where this argument of space and state restructuring at different scales enters into our chapter. So what we argue is that we have to understand first the state, we have to open it up. It's not just what happens here in Buenos Aires, provinces, many actors beyond the state that influence state policies. And in particular, considering that multi-scale perspective of the state, what we argue is that we have to consider the economic situation of the country during the 10 years, that everyone here knows is quite problematic. We haven't been able to sustain, as a country, sustain economic growth during the last 10 years, and the poverty level is quite high, currently it's around 37%. This was aggravated with this IMF debt, COVID-19, of course, as in many other countries. So in that situation, one of the challenges that Argentina has is to increase exports, and on the other hand, to diversify its economy that is totally, quite dependent on agricultural exports, in particular soybeans, that the main market is China, and quite a lot of that infrastructure, and land, territory, and all the environmental consequences related to that are connected with China. And that is an obvious and a main pillar, if you want, why, Argentina policymakers, they doubt when the US tries to push them out from that cooperation with China. But on the other hand, what we did in our chapter is not to focus on what is there, what we already know, what is active, what is working, but on the potentials. During the last 10 years, what we saw by analyzing the policies of these different coalitions is that the identification of new growth engines more or less coincided. And two sectors appeared frequently, but we know the policies that we saw. And these were, on the one hand, shale gas and oil, and on the other hand, lithium mining. And what we argue in our chapter is we analyze the strategies of the state in different provinces at the national level that try to link or to attract Chinese actors or US, American actors to invest no, and to support, to fund these different sectors to stimulate, no, to incentivize the growth of the economy. So, they are defined what you were presented at the beginning. No, different strategies, some located at the north of the country, others located at the south, that link to different value chains centered on the US or China. So let me very briefly summarize these two cases to make the case. In the case of shale, gas, and oil, what we did is we synthesized the rights, of this regime that basically aimed to exploit vaca muerta, or dead cow, translation. Don't want to say in India, no, that's problematic. It was problematic for the government to visit there. So it spans 30,000 square kilometers in the Patagonian province of UK. By estimates, it's the second largest shale gas and the fourth largest shale oil reserve in the world. No? And considering that data, the left-wing government that was ruling between 2011 and 2015 decided to renationalize a company that was privatized in the 90s and was in the hand of Spanish capitals. And they renationalized it to exploit vaca muerta, to invest directly, and to develop a sector that promised to make Argentina a leader in these two sectors. New regulations were passed, both in the province of Neuquén, also nationally to support this nationalization. It was quite problematic, as you can imagine. And even though this government had tensions with the US, relations were strained, the main investors and actors that they sought to involve in these projects were Texans, because they were at the forefront of the technological skills needed to extract shale oil and gas, and of course, for funding. So Chevron was one of the first multinationals investing in Vaca Muerta. When the government changed, the right-wing coalition continued the project. They even sought for more investments from the US, in particular there, immobilized resources, attracted resources from the former overseas private investment corporation, that now they changed names. But again, China was doing always background, we have to be there first before other actors, Chinese and Russians, invest in the sector. And so what we find is continuity. So that's basically what we describe in this chapter. Continuity is shale, gas, and oil sector, regardless of who was governing, trying to attract American actors to develop the sector. Now, in another case, we travel to the northern part of the country, to the province of Jujuy. And this is related to lithium mining, where we find a very similar story, a very similar plot, if you want, but with different characters. Instead of being from Texas, this one they are from Henan, from China. And here, the resource that we are trying to exploit is lithium, that you know is the white gold, that is being used in batteries for electric vehicles, and is of course considered central for the transition towards a sustainable transport. The point with this resource is that it is very unevenly distributed. 60% is located in the lithium triangle that spans Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. In Argentina, that mainly covers the province of Jujuy, and when this data were made available, I'm referring, I guess, more than 10 years ago, the government started to try to attract investment from abroad, to develop the sector and to export this resource. One of the main actors that they targeted were Chinese because they are central in this value chain, in particular in the development of lithium batteries, and on the other hand, they are becoming one of the main markets for electric vehicles as well, because you can imagine there are many, and they have also policy for the sector. So the government has been very active. The provincial government, in 2016 in particular, accelerated that attraction of Chinese investments. Several companies invested, and they are already exporting lithium from the province. But they are also seeking to industrialize part of that chain. And that in connection with the government, even though the government didn't change, that policy continued, the aim has been to convince Chinese companies not only to extract and take that resource to China, that could be problematic, but to bring skills and to produce factories here where the batteries will be locally produced and perhaps sold to the regional market. So again, we see continuity for this fact. Not in the last 10 decades, it has been a constant. And let me add a couple more things before I finish. In both cases in our chapter, we also synthesize the dark side, if you want, of these two sectors that are the very serious environmental consequences. In both cases, we are dealing with extractivist-led development strategies, no? Where the cost, negative externalities, as economists like to say, no? They are paid by the local communities, in many cases indigenous communities. So that's a problem, and there's a lot of research that we synthesize in our chapter. Now, we finished this book chapter by the beginning of 2021. So I want to add some more comments, if I have time.
Yeah,
okay. Related to what has happened since then. With the IMF, well, the debt was renegotiated. Nonetheless, it's a heavy burden. And there's much discussion on how might that condition, actually monetary policy. The IMF from the US, that's a point that's always in discussion, I guess, in any policymaker's mind. Despite the concerns, and despite the warnings from the US against the Bretton Woods and all what the Trump administration did and the Biden administration continued, Argentina, as you said, started the beginning in February, joined the Bretton Woods Initiative, and around $23 billion of infrastructure projects, infrastructure projects, were announced. Many of these infrastructure projects were similar or continuations of what were announced in 2014. No? So there we see again this non-alignment that is playing there in what's happening. Regarding the two sectors, I would say we also see a lot of continuity. No? The new ruling coalition has put these two sectors as remains, no? With a priority given to these two sectors. Perhaps after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the shale oil and gas seems to be the most immediate opportunity because prices have skyrocketed. In fact, during this week, the US ambassador was visiting Vaca Muerta and praising, oh, this is advancing very fast. Argentina is going to become a leading player in this market. And nonetheless, the government perhaps is also seeking Chinese funding to accelerate the infrastructure of shale gas, if I'm not wrong, to bring it from Ukraine to the pipelines. Yeah, the pipelines. Thanks. Regarding lithium, we find a very similar picture. More Chinese investments have been announced, and the government, both at the provincial and the national level, is advancing this strategy. Factory lithium batteries has also been announced by a Chinese company. So there we see continuity. Perhaps, and now to close, the only new thing, well, perhaps not so new, but that we didn't touch in our chapter, and here I want to connect it with this Cold War concepts, no, that maybe in the debate again. No, it's this idea of deterrence in the Second Cold War.
Deterrence.
Deterrence, yeah. Thanks. Of course, as you show in your slides, the Trump administration has made several statements against the Chinese investments in the region. At the time when we wrote this chapter, we didn't see much in the lithium sector. But now that has changed. For example, during last week, or 2 weeks ago, we don't precisely the date, but the US Southern Command has made public statements denouncing the malign Chinese and Russian, of course, investments in the region, in particular lithium, as potential ways to undermine democracies in the region. So that is just one example of many other statements that are being made and disseminated quite actively against Chinese infrastructure projects, trying to deter them from taking place. And so, of course, our argument is that there is a territorial logic, a state restructuring process that someone is pushing foreign policymakers not to take sides. But, well, now there's another strategy that I guess might also play a role, but at this time we can only speculate and we have to wait for our next chapter.
Okay. Okay, so now my role here would be to make a comment and feedback to the whole book. Well, my name is Marcelo Saguier. I'm also a researcher at the National Scientific and Political Research Council in Argentina, and a professor here at the School of Politics and Government at the National University of San Martin. And I direct the MA and PhD program in International Relations. We are actually the host institutional space that's organizing the event, this book launch. My research interests and publication focus on international political economy of the environment, and more recently visual global politics, particularly in relation to sustainable development or ecological issues. I mean, in fact, I'm now working on a project on visual narratives of the global ecological crisis towards an international political ecology of images, which is something that I'm not going to bring into this because this is a different subject, but yet, it's there, it's in the background. So, well, thanks. I would like to first of all thanks both editors for the invitation to take part in the book, and now I want to focus then on this sort of feedback, which I think is most interesting. First of all, I would like to say is that, again, with a hat put on the institution, I mean, the sort of things that we do in the MA and the PhD in particular, the sort of research that we try to stimulate among our students, among our own research, I mean, does connect very much to the core of the spirit of this project, this book project. In fact, the courses we teach, Maximiliano is a teacher in 1 and 2 that directly talk to the subject of the book, and myself in another one, in a more, not specifically in this, but sort of on the side. But overall, I mean, we do stimulate for various reasons that I would want to mention now. So we're very glad for this. So what do I want to say? Well, first of all, I want to say a first set of comments on the actual book, that we still don't have. It's in the press, and it's an idea now, but the physical book, the process, I think it's, first of all, it's very interesting the fact that not only the subject, which I will now comment, but the fact that it's a book that's made of a lot of contributors, that has many chapters, and it's really a global reach, global kind of representation of the book. The cases, each chapter talks about a different case, different projects taking place, infrastructure projects taking place in different countries around the world, with scholars that in many cases come from those countries, which is not something we should, it's very important, because the whole reflection process of making the book has tapped into the ways in which this discussion of China and the US infrastructure actually resonates in the places where the projects are taking place. And that's, that's something quite unusual, let me say. And it's a lot of work as well. I mean, as both editors would know. But just to give you a sample, I mean, the chapters include cases that take place in Kyrgyzstan, Zambia, Kenya, Philippines, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Namibia, Kazakhstan, Argentina, Turkey, Laos, Nepal, Indonesia, Vietnam, Hungary, and 3 regions. East Africa, the European Union, and outer space. So not even like, physical territory. So it is, I mean, quite and with contributors that have a lot of different processes and cultural backgrounds, because they are nationals of different countries, many times of the countries that they're writing from, and also, institutional or discipline backgrounds. Overall, the theme of the book intersects, I would say, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, my view is intersects in some of the things that global political economy and political geography are interested in, and maybe not all of them, but that's the most representative sort of kind of fields that I think that try to make some kind of dialogue around this question of how the competition or it's not competition, the word's used, the rivalry between the US and China around infrastructure, resonates or molds or shapes the geopolitics of today and its implications for development and future prospects. And this takes me right to the core of what I want to say in terms of the content and contributions I think this book makes. And first of all, okay, everyone agrees that there is lots of change happening, right? And in terms of the restructuring of the world economic system, its production system, its system of finance, of course. It's the ways in which, also the ways in which climate change and environmental crisis redefines many of the questions, discussions, issues that take place. Technology, the role of technology, we're transitioning into different technologies that redefine absolutely all discussions when it comes to politics, development, governance. So everyone agrees that we are sort of entering into a world that is uncertain, and that what we see here focused on infrastructure is a place where some of the doubts and questions and processes that concern the production or the making of a new kind of politics for a world that is different from the one that we have behind. And so some of the words or concepts that we use in international relations to try to characterize are very poor, and we don't have a language for it. I mean, the plurilateral world, the world of regions, a new multilateralism, a new multipolar world. I mean, these are all very kind of narrow, because the process is much more complex than the language that we have, right? So, but the politics is also very limited. And this is my main interest in the subject of the book. Some things are happening, but many things are happening, in fact, but there is a tendency, there's a narrative, a hegemonic, I would say, narrative, to try to represent and understand what is happening politically in terms of this polarization between the United States and China, and the political implications that it brings for other countries and societies of having to align for one or the other. I mean, that's the kind of the storyline that it's not, it's one particular storyline, but it's a storyline, or it's a narrative that I think is very poor, and it's very dangerous, by the way. It's very dangerous. So that's my understanding of what is important about this book. Because this book tries, in its great effort, because it's very difficult, has been done here, to try to explore that this process of transformation, it's way more complex, and it takes place at many more levels, or it brings in lots of issues that are really not captured by this typically bipolar or the typical narrative of the realist perspective in international relations, the more geopolitical 20th century kind of contestation and conflict between power politics, between great states, great powers. It's really not. I think that all the cases talk about the complexity and interdependence in a way, but it's not the argument of interdependence that is also a classic position in this debate. Because the global ecological crisis and technology bring in a lot more complexity that was not part of the theme of interdependence when it was formulated in the 70s. It was a whole different story. And that's only just one element that I want to bring in. So this invites us to think in different terms about the politics of this 21st century, that we all agree that is different. We all agree that China has something to do with it, and we all know that it's going to lead to different forms of governance, different forms of politics, different forms of foreign policy, different forms of production, of distribution, of thinking about nature or ecology issues. But we still don't know how to kind of describe it. Yeah? And I think the strategy for the book to engage in this big question, I think, is, or or one of the contributions or in opening this language or this exploration, I think one of them is to delve or explore the shifting relations between space and politics. I think this is brilliant. I really like that. I mean, that was the catchy part for me, to be honest. I mean, he's a China guy, but I do environmental stuff, so it got me through the space politics relation, right? And so what the cases show, and they're all very different and very rich in description and in analysis, they show that there are the experiences of how this contestation around infrastructure, I mean, does show very different stories depending on which project or which country you look into. And it does show something that we call, for example, on the one hand, overlapping topographies. Okay? Overlapping topographies, I take to mean, for the purpose of this presentation, is fixes or relation between space and politics where there are simultaneous geographies taking place in one place, right? I mean, there are projects where maybe there's Chinese people, technologies, investments, and governance, conflicts, but they're also interlinked with American, I mean, the idea of flat space, this problematic idea, very Western, modern idea of flat space, is totally kind of, I mean, for example, in the realist international relations accounts, I mean, the idea of how politics and space connect is the state, the boundaries of the state, the national territory, right? That's how politics and space connect. This is showing totally different processes that intersect that kind of boundary definition of how politics and space connect. So one set of processes I think would be characterized as overlapping topographies, where you see different, geographies at play, where you can kind of see China and the United States in relation to local, and local can be national actors, can be provincial actors, city actors, can be private actors, can be social actors. I mean, that varies depending on the case. But there's also another kind of topography, which is fragmentary topographies. Fragmentary topographies, where you see the connection between the politics and space make in terms of carving out, areas of high connectivity to global connections, interconnections. That, in a way, has a different geography, a different politics, different people, different financing, different environmental implications, different relations with territory, different manufacturing of territory, different infrastructure. I mean, they are really islands of enclave, would be the old-fashioned word to talk about this, the fragmentation of territories that have higher connectivity to global value chains, global connection, global communication, whatever. And they may coexist physically right next to another place that is completely not disconnected from those circuits. And in that sense, I say fragmentary. For example, there's in ecology, as you may know, there's this discussion about how the political, ecological implications of many of these controversial projects based on extractive industries, and this idea of zones of sacrifice, or sacrifice zones, I don't know how it's translated in English, this idea that certain areas are kind of dedicated, left to be hyper-exploited in terms of, regardless of their environmental and social implications, because they are just dedicated, just given away to be highly specialized and highly productive or purely extractive, short-term extractive kind of gains. But with or without technology, I mean, it depends with me, but those are particular territories. I mean, they're particular spaces. That's what I mean by fragmentary topographies. Maybe it's a big word. And in these sort of ways in which space and politics can fix or connect, either overlapping or fragmentary, there are different configurations of actors and temporalities. Some are fast, some are slow, but take place at different rates. For example, the examples of the Chinese projects, I mean, for how many years we've been talking here in Argentina, some the dams in the south, the nuclear plant energy, they come back, other places, you go to other of the cases that are shown in the book, and they're really like top on, like really fast. In a few months, they build, the whole infrastructure, different rates, different speeds, and so I think that's really interesting to see. That's one set of comments about what contribution the book makes, I think. Another one is this idea of decentering, methodologically, decentering the idea of the state, okay? Because the state here is not the starting point to see what happens outside the foreign policy, like in the domestic or national and the foreign, or the starting point, how markets and technology influence choices and reduces space for states, and that conventional idea, typical of more realist thinking in international relations, realist perspective, theoretical perspective, not only has problems with its relation to space, as was my previous point, but also has a problem because it's assumed that states exist, and then what options they actually have or don't have. Rather than thinking in terms of the state as a process itself, the state is not a starting point. The state is the process and needs to be seen in terms of change. So this is the nice idea of state restructuring or state internationalization of the state in some of the literature critical takes on international political economy, which is how the state-society, and I would add state-society-nature relations change, in this case, in relation to different ways of interconnecting to this geopolitical context of contestation around infrastructure integration. Okay? The state itself changes, and its relation to society, what are the sectors that connect, benefit, is it purely extractive, is it industrial kind of linkage with some sort of industrial project, is it extractivism, is it some form of I don't know, sustainable production, mostly lacking by the way, but the point, the theoretical point that I'm interested in this intervention. So it denaturalizes the state. It's not that we go one way or we go another. The state itself is changing, right? And its relation to society, to social forces, to nature, etc., with all its implications, not all good, so by doing this, I think that there's the third and last comment, the political implications of this kind of way of looking at contestation around, or the competition around infrastructure. Because the assumption is that, and this is not just purely academic kind of thinking just for the library, the idea is that ideas must or should have any implication in how we do things, how we understand things, the power dimension of research, right? The power implications. And so what I think this brings in, which I think is important. Well, on the one hand, what I said at the beginning, it allows us to move beyond this dichotomic, polarizing kind of narrative, that it's also continuity. We talk about Trump, but it's happening now still. It is very much sponsored or promoted. It is a form of governance. Creating that polarization is a form of stake in the governance of international relations. Okay, we don't want that. I think not only we don't want it, but I think or I don't want it at least. But I think that it's politically dangerous in terms of what it can bring us in terms of future trajectories of where this is going. Or put it another way, I don't think it's a very productive or inspiring way of building the politics of the 21st century, which includes all these transformations that we were talking about earlier on. That's not the way we're going to have global governance. That's not how we're going to make the good things about this global integration and mitigate and hopefully terminate with bad ones, but this is clearly not going in the right direction. So we need different narrative, different politics, and of course different institutions and different practices. But I think that's the most, perhaps, the last set of things that usually come in play. First is the politics, the construction of different consensus, different forms of alliance building, different issues, different agendas, and ways of governing this process of global integration. And so I think the book invites us to think in those terms. Invites us to think also beyond purely statist kind of logic, to look and recognize that the politics of this 21st century was a very big name, but I mean, also involves other actors, multiple levels, private, public, social actors that are in many cases not just operating nationally but transnationally. And to find politics in many other places where it's actually taking place, right? Not just in the declarations or statements of top officials that kind of try to polarize the discussion. So it's an invitation to look at where the micro, meso, and grand politics takes place, the different scales, again, of politics. And also, well, as I was saying, just to finish on the very first point, because not only for developing countries or countries somewhere in the big, the non-industrial central countries like Argentina and many others that are in the book, I mean, that's not going to be the way the new multipolar world order is going to kind of come out in a nice way. I mean, I think there's room for kind of recreating basis for some sort of this old idea of old but always present idea of some form of autonomy and kind of and capacity to kind of leverage kind of your place in the world according to what's the gross majority of the countries and societies and populations want and need, right? So not being captured in this kind of Manichaean logic of either or, I think is very important. And it's very important normatively and it's very important politically, because the politics will come out of a different logic, not the one that now kind of imposes or presents itself as the only possible logic of confrontation. And this idea, as you were saying, the deterrence, this appeal to deterrence, it's either or, it's my friend or my enemy. Well, the reality shows that the cases in the book show that not only is not happening, but we need the right politics to reflect that, and to represent that kind of transition, basically. And, well, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Well, and now we open up to a conversation with the audience, feedback or questions, comments.
And can people online ask as well, or is it not?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah, but yeah, good point. But I mean, who has the control? Who has the question?
But we'll start, of course, with
Yes.
colleagues in here.
Hi, I am Javier Díaz from National University of Luján. I work on rational economics, and I am very interested in now if in your work you know that China there is a special interest about subnational linkage, because when I was Deputy Secretary of Economic Promotion in San Juan, we have to work and to negotiate a loan from the Bank of China, and I remember this was, I think, in 2009, that China is very interested in case of federal state in have like a special communications channels with province and governors and something like that. And do you think that particularly in the case of Latin America, in the case of Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, that is a federal state here, China developed a special strategy to work with subnational states that I think that the United States, not because it's not the tradition of the United States foreign policies, but because Maximiliano, I tell to us about Neuquén and something like that. I remember several visits from China ambassador to Neuquén or notice about that. And when I was Secretary of Province of Sichuan, I noticed that the interest of the Bank of China and the Embassy of China to work with the governor, to have the contact details from the governor, from the Ministry of Development and something like that. What do you think about that?
Well, if there's more questions and comments, maybe we can take a couple, depending. I mean, if we have many, we have only one. Any more? Yes.
Well, first and foremost, thanks to all the panelists. Really interesting, richly detailed presentations, and very great ideas to work with as well. Marcelo actually touched on many of the ideas I wanted to discuss or to actually ask about. So I'm left with just one thing that remains kind of unconvincing to me, which is the idea of the Cold War 2.0 or whatever. I mean, it seems to me that the original Cold War had two sides with sort of fixed positions, spheres of influence, and both sides with different strategies were playing the same game. In this case, I'm kind of not seeing exactly the same, in the sense that China is indeed sort of projecting power, projecting itself towards the world with these infrastructure initiatives, while the US seems to be stuck in the previous Cold War. You mentioned that there's the idea that it's not about containment, but then it's surrounding China and Taiwan, Singapore, even Vietnam, Japan, Korea. And it's also playing the kind of game of spheres of influence also in Latin America. I mean, kind of threatening, quote unquote, different states not to build these nuclear plants funded by China, not to build these integrated naval force, base in Ushuaia, not to build these dams to produce electricity and whatnot. And it's not actually coming to the game with the sort of countering China's strategy with another infrastructure project, so to speak. So is this kind of do you think that actually the notion of the Cold War 2.0 is actually the best term to describe what we're looking, or is it kind of perhaps lazy? I don't know if that's the word. But...
Great. Do we have another?
Sí,
Yes.
en castellano.
Dale.
Quería saber si dentro de la lógica territorial vos podés localizar los préstamos financieros, pero a través de los swap o de reservas del Banco Central más que de inversiones de proyectos.
Okay.
Y si ahí se da esa rivalidad.
What is whether you can account in terms of territorial logic, the swaps, the financial loans, not so much the investments, but say that they are financial aspect. Gracias. ¿Se pueden presentar para conocer?
Sí, mi nombre es Rocío y estoy en la maestría de Sociología Económica, así que estoy acá
De acá de Usama. Bien. Gracias. Bueno, pues presentaste y Bruno.
Bruno Delaponte, I'm a researcher at the University of San Martin as well. I teach foreign policy analysis and international security.
Tenemos más, do we have any more questions? This round, then we have another round. Yeah? Okay.
I don't know how we want to divide. I guess the questions were to all four of us.
I think we'll want to leave it.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Yeah. I think the first question from Javier, I think I might leave that to you because it has to do with perhaps the way that we discussed this earlier, the kind of direct engagement with Jujuy in different states and in a federalist system. And I don't know if Meredith wants to discuss, to respond to that or not. I would take this question about whether or not the Second Cold War is an appropriate name for this conflict. I mean, I would say a couple of things. First, the argument of whether or not it's a lazy analogy, or whether it's an analogy at all. The reason I disagree with that is because it loses sight of historical process. It's comparative, right? It's comparing whether or not the present is similar or dissimilar with the past. And to me, that's a rather academic question. It doesn't have to be similar at all with the Cold War to be the Second Cold War. And that's the point I was trying to make when I said, well, World War II is entirely different from World War I. The reason why we call them first and second is because they're both part of a process. And the overarching story in that process is the collapse of these old Eurasian empires. You know, within about, what is it, from 1911 to 1923, all of the land-based empires collapsed. Qing Dynasty, the Qajar in Iran, Ottoman Empire, Habsburgs, and the Romanovs. They all collapsed and they were replaced by new powers, and that kind of, that process saw a major challenge and a competition to see who would be the next hegemon, and Germany and Japan, of course, were driving that as the new powers. So, all right, so that's this big overarching story, and within that you have these discrete periods of First and Second World Wars. My argument is that we're seeing something similar, that old orthodox understanding of the Cold War that really saw it exclusively as a bipolar conflict between the Soviet Union and the US is insufficient. And in fact, historians are already reappraising it. Instead, I think we have this similarly process-based view of history who will say that actually China was a central protagonist all along, and what we're really seeing is the rise of China, you could say, quite simply, as an international, as a global power that seeks to influence the international order. Historians talk in this about the 1960s as global Maoism. Now we talk about global China. These are just two stages within this longer process. Whether or not you want to call it Cold War or something else, I guess that's fine. You can call it, as long as if you take a process-based view, which I insist on, you can call it anything else. I mean, the word, Cold War, the term was introduced by George Orwell. It was introduced to describe a state of affairs that everyone knew existed, but hadn't been named yet. And then it kind of caught on, and it was, convincing as a term. So it's not like an official legal term or anything. It was named retrospectively after the tensions already began after World War II. I find it, again, compelling in the sense that I think China was a great power competitor then, pursuing the same objectives that it's pursuing now, only now it's much more likely to achieve those objectives if it hasn't already. So, yeah, we can debate it further, but I think for me it's because of that longer a process-based view why I find it appropriate. And it doesn't have to be at all similar in the way that it plays out. I mean, whether it's containment or not containment territory logic, it will be different in many respects. Thank you. And I don't know if you coordinate with Meredith if she wants to respond to any of the questions, or
raise your hand, Meredith, if you want to jump in or any other questions. Yeah.
I can speak a little bit, perhaps, to the third question, just very briefly on kind of the role of financial mechanisms and loans in all of this. One thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked if we want to think about how these dynamics are contextualized in particular places and how a variety of factors impact them is there's been so much attention to loans in kind of this very top-down way, especially in Sri Lanka, the argument with the Hemmaputta, the port in Sri Lanka, being seized by China, like this kind of all blew up with these arguments about debt trap diplomacy. And sometimes those overlook how detrimental that has been to China and to China's bilateral and international relations. So it's important to recognize how actors, when it comes to things like loans, it's so easy to think of them as all the power lies with the one granting the loan, but it can quickly be kind of flipped on its head from a more kind of public relations and narrative standpoint. And certainly the case in Namibia and some other African countries had great success in renegotiating loans, in part because it would be such a bad story because they're portrayed as, in the kind of international relations world, the narrative is of the African state as a victim. Because that would be so detrimental to China for that narrative to really take hold, it's already there that China's exploiting Africa, that's already the narrative. African states have a surprising amount of leverage sometimes when it comes comes to renegotiating those in their best interests.
All right. We have anything else here? The third question.
Federal state.
Federal state. Well, yes. I mean, there is a whole range of politics taking place at subnational and provincial. The role of the provincial, for example, in the case of mining, as you probably mentioned, I mean, it's very clear. San Juan has a very active role, just as Jujuy has in relation to lithium and Chinese investments.
Wider than paradiplomatic scales, ¿no? Wider, más anchos, más grandes, digo, que los esquemas paradiplomáticos habituales.
Sí, yo no sé, yo no me especifico, no trabajo especialmente en temas de paradiplomacia, o sea que no sé qué implica, cuán amplio o cuán estrecho es el concepto, digamos, ¿no? Pero, I'm sorry, he's asking whether the para-diplomacy kind of track of provincial governments going and kind of leveraging, negotiating agreements or seeking out investments, which is something, at least in Argentina, because we have a federal system here, and a constitution which grants natural resources to provinces. I mean, the way it's been set up, I mean, has created a context where provinces do have an active role as actors of this political economy of investments on resources, and some of them, San Juan, for example, or I would say Neuquén as well, most likely, Jujuy, I mean, are very. I mean, I don't know within the specific IR sub-discipline that deals with power diplomacy, as it's usually called, whether that's a good framing kind of discussion or conceptual, to kind of contain all which actually takes place in the politics. But yes, I mean, for example, in relation to Canada, for example, I mean, San Juan has been very active in all these mining conferences and with the government in Canada. I mean, there is a different level of autonomy, political kind of relations that takes place at the provincial level, as far as I understand. But there are people that know much more about this than myself, so I mean, I'm just commenting broadly.
Yeah, I can also comment that before, your question was also directed towards China, no? If there's a policy there promoting these subnational links, no?
Yes. Because, for example, the last governor of San Juan, Governor Gioja, its nephew goes directly to China, to one province, I don't remember which one, and for this strong relationships, like state levels.
Exactly. So there, I would suggest, well, it's not my idea, many authors are already doing this. They apply this concept of state restructuring towards China, in China, no? So the Chinese thing. Because there's also this common belief that China is the central government, always directed by Xi Jinping, and all follow orders as soldiers. But in fact, what you have are many provinces competing, many huge cities. There are also competing some cities that have 20 million inhabitants, and they have their own internationalization strategies. And I think what you are trying to describe connects with that. So I would recommend you to look this text speaking of the state restructuring and state scaling, rescaling in China.
Yeah. And another,
Well, I just have a question that speaks a little bit to the question you had about finance, and it's a question for you, Maximiliano. So, a while ago, the government of Nepal was in crisis because they accepted a loan from the United States, from the Millennium Challenge account, for about $500 million for infrastructure. And a Chinese commentator, I forget if it was the ambassador or someone in Beijing or just the People's Daily, said that this was a case of debt trap diplomacy. It was quite interesting because this term is often used by Western critics of China for infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, Meredith just mentioned. But it struck me when you were talking about the IMF. I mean, Donald Trump pressured the IMF to distribute the largest loan in its history to Argentina in order to help the previous government in the election, which it subsequently lost. So now Argentina is saddled with this debt, and the question I have is then is that used to pressure Argentina? Is that debt used to pressure Argentina? I mean, that would be a classic case then of debt trap diplomacy. Has anyone said this at all with regard to U.S. policy in Argentina, or not?
I think it's a question for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Others. So, well, I don't have the evidence.
Yeah. No, but has this term ever been used? That
Debt trap
no.
Okay. No.
I mean, it's a great comparison. I will start using it from now, like things. But no, I mean, that's goes back to this whole idea of the narratives, right? What's political about the way of talking about certain things. I mean, China has been a target of criticisms in many parts in the world, well, for sure. I mean, about death traps in Bolivia. Well, we had a whole on that subject, and so it's not that it's an easy way. I mean, it's also been used politically for its Chinese adversaries, clearly. But interestingly, I mean, we don't hear the term used the other way around. I mean, there's the old concept. But it's death trap. I mean, another last point. I mean, much of the discussion on environmental policies and transitions to energy and to climate actions, I mean, has one of its issues, the connection with debt. I mean, we have now, for example, reinforcing the trend towards extractivism, and we're clearly trapped in that pathway, partly because of the,
you have to service the debt.
We have to service the debt.
Yeah.
So I mean, so there's clearly a structural relation between one and the other.
Yeah.
And the stakes on the possibility of putting that in the agenda in the global space, the global multilateral discussions around that discussion, and connecting the two through debt swaps for climate actions or whatever other way of unknown debt or whatever, that would be much more difficult. But I mean, it's clearly ruled out of the discussion. So I mean, needless to say that it's not a fair play. Anyway, do we have any more questions? No? Sure? Online? No? Okay. Well, maybe with this we can bring this to an end and thank also Jessica, who's somewhere in some airport, we don't know in which country, hearing us now, and Seth, both the editors, and the rest of the contributors in the book. We're glad to. And Meredith, that is on the other side. Where are you, Meredith? Where are you talking from?
Live from Columbia, South Carolina.
Well, hopefully we get to meet some of the other people in the book at some point.
That's the great thing about doing this with Zoom is that the pandemic, it was possible to do all of this, but it's a bit unfortunate now. We've been engaged with so many great people. I wish we could have a big party. I don't know when that will be possible.
Not on Zoom.
No, not at all.
Well, thank you very much, and we have a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Take care, Meredith. Thank you.
Bye, Meredith.
Thank you all so much. Such a pleasure to see you virtually.